What I wanted to start with are, challenges that you think LGBTQ plus scholars and academics face that most people are unaware of.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank you for raising the question, because especially the sort of like complicated visibility or awareness, I think is something that's very hard to talk about. I think we do live in, of course, not everybody, but we do live in an age where certain types of sensitivities are quite fashionable. So there's lots of talk about diversity or political correctness, or depending on, who plays the ball. At the same time, I think sometimes this assumed awareness actually forecloses the actual lived experiences of, for example, LGBTIQ plus people in academia, which then are still a bit different from what the mainstream assumes. So I, for example, experienced that in, still pronoun complications, also assumptions about what a family is or what a relationship is. It doesn't necessarily have something to do with sexual orientation or something like that, but more with a very broad heteronormative assumption that, we all more or less live the same kinds of lives and have the same kind of struggles at home, which I don't really think is very true. So that's definitely a bit of a challenge, how to still say, no, this is not my life. No, this is not my story. But I'm happy to talk more about it or more concretely, but I think that's maybe as a starter something that I still see as a challenge to kind of like denormalize heteronormativity.
You brought up especially pronouns, right? Because I think some people, they're like, hey, when I'm working, I don't want to talk about my personal life or whatever. But pronouns are so important.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I've always been a bit of a tomboyish child. I then had a feminine sort of like puberty phase, which now has very much grown out of me again. But I still identify as she, her. I don't get offended when people call me they. But for example, I go by the nickname Fred, which could arguably also be a male gender, or I might be non-binary or something like that. So I always do appreciate when people ask me, and I don't think cis people should get offended by being asked about their pronouns. I was recently in a conversation with a male older colleague who did matter-of-factly get offended when I asked him about his pronouns. And I mean, I don't see an issue to confirm that this is your pronoun. And I just don't want to make assumptions. And I think we all should make less assumptions, for example, in the case of pronouns.
And I mean, how do you see perhaps that playing out in the classroom? Because I know the conversation around it is some people might be trans, right? But they're not out and they don't feel comfortable with that. But maybe like via email, or when you're personally speaking to them, privately, they might want that experience. So how do you think colleges, and I think educators in general, should approach that in a way that is sensitive and respectful and that doesn't force people to either have to stick to a pronoun that they present but that they don't have to identify with?
Correct them. I think the question of the classroom really does depend on the size. So I was just teaching a lecture. I mean, it wasn't always all students in the classroom. It was very hybrid. But I mean, if you have over 100 students sitting in a classroom, it's very difficult to have everybody say their pronoun. But at least I always ask for their name. And I think next year round, I would also say, can you say your name, your pronoun? So also to normalize this practice of pronoun asking. And again, I'm speaking here from a Dutch context while I'm a German citizen, not necessarily identifying as a German, but that's what my passport says. And I notice here it's not a very common thing in the language as well. So it also depends, if I'm teaching in English and many of the students are not speaking in their mother tongue, I think they're maybe even less comfortable in saying this. And in the Dutch language, it's not a very developed gender sensitive kind of conversation in the beginning. But for example, I was in Canada beforehand, where it was extremely normal and common in department meetings or anywhere else to do a round of introductions with the pronouns. But again, it's a question of, shifting visibilities, for example, to put it in your email footer, to put it in your, I think on Zoom, you can also have an automatic slot for the pronouns and stuff like that. And I think the more this is visible, the more it becomes a well-rounded possibility for conversation. And then in the classroom, coming back to your question, enable students who might be non-binary or who just are in a transition to say, let's just call me them for now, or call me she for now. I think that would, give off a different atmosphere, I would hope.
You've talked very much about the challenges of visibility because it's true, right? There's certain identities that are a lot more obvious versus with an identity, like your gender or your sexuality, where, some people do identify in a very fluid way or, privately and publicly they identify differently. I think being able to have even just that footer in the email, right? Or like in the Zoom, I think it help students who might be in that place be, feel more comfortable kind of opening up.
Yeah. And I think it's so interesting because I do have a lot of trans friends, not so much colleagues. I mean, I know there is trans academics, but in my sort of like world, I don't really collaborate with any of them to this point. I know how much pain misgendering can inflict. So I'm wondering, can't we as the majority protect and try to contribute to healing of people who have felt really violated? I think it's kind of like a strange gift one could give to just make this a bit more of a commonsensical kind of topic. And I've also been misgendered. Like people have legit thought I was, a dapper, cute boy in a PhD defense. I don't know what I was wearing on that day, but still, that shouldn't matter. That was such a weird experience. So I also speak from my own experience in saying, I think we should try to avoid these potentially really hurtful and really violent experiences.
Going off of that, there's a lot of conversations about spaces in academia for different groups and what does that mean? And the last interview that I did, we kind of got to that point of being like, well, a lot of the times the only space is limited to kind of like a gay straight alliance or like an LGBTQ plus group, but there isn't necessarily something per department. There isn't a way for students to connect perhaps in the same discipline. If you study, humanities, arts, you'll probably find a bit more open spaces sometimes than you would in something maybe like science or business, for example. And, what do those students do if they don't feel comfortable going to a meeting where they're not going to have perhaps similar interest or where they don't find a place for themselves within the discipline?
And I mean, as much as I'm kind of like almost nostalgic about the term gay straight alliance, that obviously doesn't really capture what's going on, right? And some queer people, because I mean, let's just take the bit more inclusive term of queerness, don't want to be singled out to, meet once a month to eat pizza together because they all have a different sexual orientation than heterosexuality. Like that's a very strange way of compartmentalizing identity politics. And I think from the student experience, that's still something very different also from the faculty experience, right? So if I'm thinking back, actually, I started graduate school as out. I was looking for these like queer offers or student activities and stuff like that. I don't think I minded it when it was more on like homosexuality rather than queerness because I still felt kind of like welcome. But on faculty level, I actually recently had a conversation with a colleague of whether we should start a queer faculty initiative and then figured, you know what? It's basically just you and me. So, I mean, of course, we can go and have beers together, but we don't really know what else we're going to be doing than, looking at each other. I mean, this might be different in different socio-demographic or geographic locations. Here, the student body and the faculty, I think, are less diverse on many criteria than in other places. But I think sometimes these like special interest offers also can kind of like further marginalize people who already know about each other's difficult experiences. Of course, it's always good to meet more people that you can talk to, be it based on gender or sexuality or something. But sometimes I also feel like, shouldn't we just be at the regular hangout?
In a different way, but when I started college, and I didn't realize how weird this was until like a couple of years ago when I had a conversation with somebody and they were like, wait, sorry, what? They had the regular orientation. They had an orientation for international students, which made sense because they, kind of needed something a little bit different there. But then they had like a diverse orientation, which was the African American kids and the Hispanic kids. And then the last day they kind of chucked us in, like everyone else, into the regular orientation. And it was a very odd experience because yes, it was nice to meet these people because I was like, hey, we have similar backgrounds. We kind of connect in ways that I'm not going to necessarily connect with my other classmates. But then none of these people, for example, were in my major.
Yeah. And then there is like a weird and also kind of lazy meshing, I think, of differences that are different from each other. That's why they're called differences. I also did grad school as an international student. So I went to Canada to do a master's, and I was actually at a similar international, well, not diverse, but international students welcoming gathering. I don't know what I have more in common with a student from China who's doing an MBA here, where they pay tens of thousands of dollars for, than me doing my lofty political philosophy degree on a scholarship. So there is also these like strange assumptions of similarity and difference that sometimes I don't find really helpful. And also it makes the mainstream whoever and whatever that is, populations less knowledgeable about individual experiences that are not from this mainstream, right? So it's like, okay, it's great if the diverse people learn about their different experiences of diversity, but wouldn't, the sort of like straw type of the white middle-aged cis dude, wouldn't they have to learn from what it's like to be crazy old me who doesn't have all the same kind of experiences? And we actually have a very beautiful weekly gathering here at our department, or bigger department group, which I would say, and I hope nobody would take offense in this, I think the most well-represented group is men over, now let's say 45, who have been born in the Netherlands, but that I love going there and drinking beer with them. And I feel like everybody likes this kind of experience because you do talk about different topics. There's nothing wrong with, being a white cis person. It's just nice to be self-reflexive and figure out that your experience of the world, especially in academia, is not the only one. And that we do, in order to make universities future-oriented or future-proof, I think we need to really rebuild these institutions and apply different categories and different currencies to hire different kinds of people who might not have had the straightforward, super legible kind of CV, but might be interesting educators or might be really great writers or something like that. I just think we can all learn from engaging more with diversity.
Kind of going off of what you're saying, maybe what we need more of in terms of these welcoming spaces is to create them in the departments and maybe the classroom as well, both through like who's teaching, but also what we're teaching.
Definitely the multi-pronged approach of trying to just live your own life in the way that it is and trying to claim space for that in the mainstream department meetings or whatever, and also the institutional politics, so that you kind of like from your personal experience spill over into how policies and institutional structures should change. So I think you should just be who you want to be and challenge the institutions by just being yourself, but also be part of the institutional conversations and transformations. For example, we have lots of debates about hiring politics. Do we, specifically look for a person from a specific gender, or do we look specifically for somebody who has some sort of diversity identity marker, or is that exceptionalizing? I think sometimes it's quite strange to have these conversations, but they're definitely necessary because otherwise the same types of people always fall through the grid, and the same types of people always stick to the grid because they did everything right, or they did just what is to be expected in a sort of like linear career. But then you also produce the same kinds of people who teach the same kinds of topics.
Being part of queer academia, how does that inform the way that you approach research, writing, teaching?
I think in my case, it like interestingly intersects with my actual research areas. I'm in cultural geography now, but I'm trained as a political theorist and urban sociologist. And I'm interested in, new modes of political engagement and what does it mean to be political. I also work a lot on artists and cultural workers in cities. So I have an inclination to be more interested in creativity and artistic practice and stuff like that. And in my case, that really spills over into how I want to write and where and how I want to present a paper, or, I write a lot of poetry. Increasingly now that I have a permanent contract, which is also like a significant factor in what of your personality do you feel like you can offer to people or you can dare to bring in the mix. I feel like I increasingly play with these more creative approaches that also relate to my queerness, right? Because queer is not only a sexual orientation, that's also like a politics of life, how you see the world in flux and as a fluid thing, and challenging absolute truths and things like that. And my feeling is that I increasingly bring this also into the classroom with like more playful methods, sometimes even like doubting ways of writing and stuff like that. Or I want to offer students different types of media to express themselves. I think we're very stuck on text, and as much as I love physical writing, I think the textuality of academia can sometimes also be quite constrictive. For example, I'm teaching a course next year where I'm giving students the opportunity either do a sort of like essay submission at the end, or do a creative submission. So it could be a podcast, it could be a performance, it could be a video, it could be like a photography essay and stuff like that. And there's still going to be a component of writing because I acknowledge that that is a very solid way of assessing progress. But also I acknowledge acknowledge that it's not the only way. So I really think we also need to work to enable students to express themselves in the ways that they're good at. And that's also the future, I think, of a lot of other industries. If we're considering the university as a place to educate people to be good employees or to be employable, I think we also need to give them skills in, for example, social media, or not only writing long papers with lots of citations, because I don't think that's much of use in the work world.
I worked in writing centers for a while, and I had a lot of students, and their stress was always the same. They were like, I want this to sound academic and I want this to sound smart. But, I think it was so important to give them that ability to express themselves in the way that they would actually talk.
Yeah. And I know what you mean with this. I want this to sound academic. And I definitely feel like I was partially complicit, largely also throughout my PhD, which creates this kind of like weird artificial like mimicking of something that's supposed to be academia, where I'm like, well, aren't we academia while we're here and while we're taking classes and while we're teaching courses and while we're writing papers? So I feel like we should maybe stop running after a certain archetype or maybe stereotype of what qualifies as academic. So I think by, again, being different, you then kind of like mold the notion of what that academic stuff is. Like I sometimes think about that in terms of like how I dress or how I speak. I'm like, well, I don't know if I look like your typical academic, but then also I am an academic and this is how I look. So isn't this what an academic looks like? You know what I mean? You could almost do these like fun, logical riddles with it, which in the end just molds the perception, I guess.
You were talking about, different ways of writing and different ways of approaching the typical assignment. How do you think in different disciplines, writing can be more reflective of different experiences and empowering to the student?
I mean, of course, I'm speaking more from a context of social sciences, we're in a faculty of management here, but so I don't really know how chemists or nuclear biologists or whatever these, very smart people do, like how their writing can be a bit more queer. But I mean, I guess you can also say, like, have I conducted this experiment on some molecule as a man or a woman, as a PhD student with a temporary contract, or as a tenured professor who can, rerun these experiments 15 times. So there's always like power politics inscribed into academic writing and stuff like that. But maybe, a bit closer to home in the way that we write or how students can write as well. What are the assessment criteria? Sometimes I wonder. You can create a coherent argument in a lot of different narrative ways. And I acknowledge, I've been educated partially in the German academic system, which is very sort of like, here is your structure, here is your 15 subchapters, Roman 2, X2, whatever subchapter. So the table of content itself is 3 pages long. Of course, there is some, benefit to systematicity and structure and stuff like that. But I also think that limits and standardizes narratives that might also flow from different ways of applying a system or of being stringent or traceable. So sometimes I think we should actually reevaluate the kind of like validity criteria that we work with when we assess student papers, because if they're all squeezed into the same scheme, I also feel like we're taking away the opportunities for students to express themselves in ways, or like, work with creative data that they gathered. They've done an internship or something like that. Where do they tell the story of what it was like to be in this place if we have too limited a kind of expectation also of the text?
Why do you think representation, and we've kind of covered this a little bit, but why do you think it is important to have that representation across disciplines and not, as we said earlier, maybe just like, here's the one token professor or, this one specific group?
I actually think that's kind of difficult. So I do think I'm an interdisciplinary scholar. I've also worked in a lot of different disciplines. So for example, like I said, I'm trained in political science or political philosophy and sociology, but then I've worked in urban planning and in arts and design. Now I'm in geography. I think there is a kind of like maybe representational openness depending on disciplines, but also it's kind of like a weirdly self-fulfilling prophecy. If certain disciplines are more open, they also then attract people who are wanting to think and work a little bit more outside the box. I also think we honestly need more representational diversity in the most conservative of disciplines, because otherwise they can kind of like keep doing their thing, which is not open-minded and which doesn't produce new and innovative knowledge or, outward oriented people and, future leaders and whatnot. All disciplines should be more diverse. We have lots of conversations at our institution about do we actually still need create a faculty structure and like what is the future of certain disciplinary, of course they don't call it silos, but of boxes and administrative structures and stuff like that. And I sometimes think, I don't know if we actually need them. Couldn't we also work thematically? Or, for example, if you're interested in gender, what kind of beautiful collaborations lie ahead if you put somebody who's interested in gender from a biology perspective and together with somebody who's interested in gender from a sort of like social theory perspective. And I mean, there is already some really, cutting edge interdisciplinary work happening, but I also know that it can be quite hard to kind of like justify this type of interdisciplinary research, both with regards to funders, but also with regards to your home discipline in terms of like, oh, what kind of crazy data did you produce here? And in which journal that's acknowledged in our discipline are you going to publish this and stuff like that? Sometimes I wish that wasn't so much a thing. Sometimes I wish it was just like, oh, that's exciting. I've never heard of this blend of disciplinary approaches before. I think my plea for why representation across disciplines is crucial everywhere maybe comes through.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and I loved what you said about, paying attention to those areas where representation isn't already there. We don't want to just be like, well, that department's a lost cause, so we'll just keep it here, because you are kind of alienating the students who are there.
And also, both again on the student level and on like faculty level, because imagine you're the only odd one out in the, I don't know, this is just an example, in the faculty of law, but then your voice will continuously be marginalized and the procedures or like the status quo of that particular department, again, fictional example, will just never really have a counterweight. And that's just a classic example of a specific reproduction of power that is super dangerous, I think, and basically is stagnating in the worst case and just ever self-reproducing. But then, of course, sometimes you have the experience that one voice isn't enough to pull the whole conversation around. And of course, we also need to talk about the sort of like responsibility and the energy it takes to do this and to like, be the poster child for another type of academic or something like that. And I've gone through different phases of being like, oh yeah, I can be the poster child for, like all these things being sort of like positively tokenized. And sometimes I'm like, okay, people, I cannot respond to all diversity related issues that are wrong in a specific place, because obviously I am not the most diverse person on the planet, depending on where you put me. And also I am just only me speaking for myself. Yeah, these questions of like allyship and stuff like that, I think need to be pushed much further. So
absolutely, because I think, as you said, right, if it's just one person, it's very easy to kind of have your opinion overlooked. But if you do have then other people having these conversations and kind of trying to see it from your perspective as well, that gives you more support.
And also in that sense, sometimes I think it's good to individualize narratives and to say, hey, this is my experience. I want you to acknowledge my experience and please change the structures accordingly. But sometimes I also think it's helpful to say, hey, this is a systemic error or a systemic lack of representation that has nothing to do with me wanting to work with more women as much as I love women. But this is also a thing that everybody is affected by. So it's not only my personal, oh, here comes the, queer person who's of course going to argue that we need more women somewhere. That's not really my personal point as much as it is my personal point. And there again, we have this multi-pronged approach of, making it individual, but also making it about the whole systemic debate, that it's not about my personal benefit or any sort to work in a more diverse work culture or something like that.
It's kind of a mixture of both, right? You obviously, you are going to, if you have a really negative experience, you want to be like, hey, I'm bringing this up because I would like this to not happen again. But then it's also being able to speak up for others as well and being like, okay, yes, I went through this, but other people have already gone through this as well. And this is what I need to change. I'm not asking you to do me a favor. I'm asking for a necessary change that's going to benefit more people.
Yeah. And I often feel like it is actually about creating paper trails of some sort, or like to speak out about experiences that you've had. Of course, you need to be cautious, and like it depends on the context of like how you do this. Sometimes I don't think calling out extreme injustices is the most resonating way to do it. But I do think a lot of universities, and they might not, put put it like me, but I think their concern is to stay relevant. I think if that's your concern, you should look to the very fast changing sociodemographics of students and of the world population, which, is still not limited to the West. I am sometimes surprised how we have such weird misrepresentations, basically, of who's studying, who's interested in certain things, matched with the faculty. There seems to be like a weird lag of representation.
And it goes back to, what you were saying at the start about, who's making these decisions. And if you don't have that representation in the administration and the faculty, it's never going to reach the students, because they're always going to be like, well, this is what I, without the personal experience, think would be beneficial, which is how we end up with the more marginalized type of, attempts at creating spaces instead of having something that welcomes them into the whole of, their department.
And I think if we don't, create more welcoming environments for different types of people, it'll just stay a huge turnoff as well. Like maybe the most intriguing and also like intellectually stimulating people choose to not pursue academia because they don't think it is a place for them to thrive and to do their thing, which I think would be a huge shame, because isn't that in the end what academia is all about? Generating new ideas and really pushing society and really rethinking the possibilities that we have. I mean, I very consciously chose to do a PhD after having worked full time, and I, by no means regret it, but I also never had a very specific plan to stay in academia or saw myself being, particularly suited to do that. So it's just now been a like random chain of lucky instances that I'm still here. I'm not sure how much I would have fought for it if I hadn't seen some glimpses of this can be a place where you can really do beautiful things, where there is inspiring people who take you under their wing for an amount of time. And I think we need to keep signaling these opportunities as well, especially for students who might have a harder time fitting into the pre-formatted ways of this is how you're going to get a good grade, and as if that was everything that mattered. But I think we need to be more flexible also on our ends as teachers to accommodate students. And of course, it's difficult when we're all completely overworked and we have too much to do in too little time, and it is this weird sort of like rushing the masses through. But I think sometimes we do have these opportunities to build meaningful connections with students. They are, learning experiences for both the teachers and the students.
What do you think are some misconceptions people might have about queer people in academia?
I think sometimes there is this sort of strange equalization of, for example, you are a gay man, and then you do research only about gay things because that's all that matters in your life. I mean, a gay man might easily do research on global migration and microfinance in Indonesia, and probably his fictional gayness has something to do with the way that he does research on non-gay things. But that's another thing of like, just because a person is queer, it doesn't mean that their whole world only revolves around some sort of like navel-gazing research activity, but still it matters that they are not heterosexual or heteronormative. I don't even think the heterosexual is so important. It's more the heteronormative assumption about what's normal, what do you want from life, and stuff like that. So I think some of the misconceptions are layered, exceptional thing that you do, that everything you do is other than what we do, and that's not very helpful because it just keeps putting people into boxes. That's a very interesting question. Also, that there is a specific need for making everything sort of like as a parallel structure to regular academia, and then let's just do an extra thing for the rainbow people. And I'm like, doesn't everybody kind of like love rainbows and glitter and Lady Gaga or something like that? I feel like there shouldn't be such a strong separation.
We just kind of like, acknowledging the identity without making it the entire person.
Yeah, and also, for example, I am married to a woman. Just because I'm married to a woman, it doesn't mean that certain other things don't appeal to me. I still have an opinion about other things that are not necessarily part of my personal life. But I think that's not limited to LGBTIQ plus people in academia. That should also be connected to heterosexual people. So I shouldn't be making assumption just because I have a straight colleague who has 2 kids and a dog that they're boring, because they might not be. They might be super rad. Generally, we should, be more cautious about making assumptions and just talk to each other. And literally also, as much as this is possible with this pandemic world, socialize and gain a more humane understanding of who we are as academics. Like, I'm working with this group in a very interdisciplinary setting in my institution, and we're talking about work life, and we're about to launch a series that's called The Humans of Radboud, which is my university's name. And the main goal of this portrait series is to not only talk about people's research, who are arguably researchers by definition of their job, but also they do many other things. And I think it's really interesting to learn about who are you as a human? How do you work? What do you do to take care of yourself? What do you do when you're really stressed? How do you celebrate when something cool happens? Projecting myself into students' shoes, I don't think they ever know anything about these things, about us as their lecturers. And maybe they don't care, and that's fine. But also, sometimes it might help to also establish a different type of dialogue or understanding, mutual understanding, to be like, oh, I see, you're a human that, likes ice cream too. That's a very, public secret about myself. Like that, I think it's good for people to know that. So
absolutely. And I think assignments and stuff like that really, if we put that emphasis right on their identity being a part of their writing, I think that opens up that space for them.
Yeah. And I think in a lot of other ways, identities also shape the way that you teach anyways, right? Like the texts you select. Do you select guest speakers? Are you on time? Are you responding to emails and stuff like that? So there is also a lot of other identity criteria or personality criteria, we could say, that shape what kind of academic you are. Like smaller, more intimate classroom settings, those are also, thinking back of my student days, not that they're 100 years ago, but like those were also the courses that I took the most out of, because also I understood where are people coming from wanting to teach this topic. Also for me as a lecturer, if I interact with a smaller group, I often feel like I can tweak some content, or I have different ways of like being on my feet to respond to, oh, I see this is really picking up with students. That's what they're interested in. And it really becomes a bit more interactive again, which I think is super exciting. Of course, you can't be perfectly prepared for that. But I think if there is this chance for taking the spark in the classroom, that is also really nice, and can also work in bigger lectures if you find a way to like keep students awake at 8 o'clock in the morning and ask them questions, or like you're a bit persistent asking them more questions than, just one or something like that. I think that's also like how knowledge or like new input stays with the students, by making it about them and trying to relate the big classics, whatever that is, to their lives and stuff like that.
And I mean, I guess as we're kind of wrapping up here, is there anything, in particular that you really wanted to discuss today that we haven't had a chance to talk about?
I think this has been a beautiful conversation in that it allows me to share the sort of like ranting anecdote about things that I've gone through or that I won from, academic institutions in the future. I don't feel like there's like a particular topic, but I do think making academic institutions a place that excited people want to work at is something that we should all take very seriously, because otherwise I do think universities turn into these like dinosaur-esque structures that don't really have a reason to be. And I think that would be a great shame. I think we need to acknowledge that knowledge works in so many different ways. And if academic institutions can be vessels to facilitate these different types of knowledge production and creation and expression through writing and stuff like that, I think we're on a pretty good way, and don't resist change as much as we all don't really know where it's going and who's leading it and how many. That would be my preferred workplace in the future. I mean, I'm likely going to stick around for 30 odd years if this is a cool place to be in and to thrive personally and to continue thriving and questioning yourself and stuff like that.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. I learned a lot. I think, a lot of people are going to get a lot out of this, both people who maybe come from a background similar to yours and have had those similar experiences, but also people who might not be aware, right? Because I think awareness is something we don't always think about.
Well, thanks so much for hosting this.
Of course. Thank you for joining us.